Hi, thanks for organizing for me to be online. Yeah, I've had a mountain biking accident and I'm unfortunately unfit to travel. But I'll be talking about the IPBES values framework. So for those of you who don't know IPBES, it's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's the biodiversity equivalent of IPCC essentially. So it forms the science policy interface for things like the Convention on Biological Diversity and a range of other conventions, and also for the new kind of Biodiversity 2030 Montreal Kunming Agreement. And a lot of what we've done in IPBES, both in the values assessment, where the IPBES values framework derives from, and obviously previous work like the IPBES global assessment, has underpinned these recent biodiversity agreements. So it's a very high impact science, and hopefully transformative really for the way that we engage with biodiversity all over the world. Now let's see if I can. Oh, there we go. It's just a little bit slow to respond. Yeah. There we go. So I was a lead author for the values assessment. The values assessment was an assessment that ran for the last 4 years. It just finished last year, 2022, looking at the multiple values of nature and methodologies for assessing them in an inclusive way. And in particular, I'll be talking about the life frames of nature's values, which is a new element to the IPBES understanding of values and the way that we have been proposing that they can be incorporated in decision making. So the IPBES values assessment, its objectives were to understand the diverse conceptualizations of nature, including through indigenous and local knowledge, understand the contributions to human well-being, looking at diverse valuation methodologies, looking at different decision-making contexts around values, the role of institutions and power, and different approaches around values for policy and decision-making. And then finally, knowledge and data gaps, uncertainties, capacity building. And a key element that's foundational to the values assessment is the IPBES values typology. So this is an overview from the summary for policymakers from the values assessment of the IPBES typology. We think about values basically at 4 main levels: worldviews and knowledge systems, broad values, specific values, and value indicators. So broad values are what in the UK NEA follow-on we used to call transcendental values. They're our overarching guiding principles and life goals, where specific values are what we used to call contextual values, and they are the value of particular things. So, for example, the value of a particular marine species in terms of, say, its regulating ecosystem service function, or in terms of its cultural value. So we call those specific values, whereas broad values are more principles like honesty, belonging, health, responsibility, stewardship, oneness. And then finally, value indicators in biophysical, monetary, or sociocultural terms. And what we realized is that these associations between values at these different levels, from worldviews to broad values to specific values to indicators, weren't arbitrary, right? There's a kind of a vertical alignment with them, and they tend to occur in sets together. And a way of organizing these sets or spotlighting these different sets of values is through the life frames: living from nature, living in nature, living with nature, and living as nature. And so the idea is that these different life frames, they shine a spotlight of particular ways of relating to nature, particular way in which nature matters to people. And the way that we think about nature is also in a very broad sense, not just in the kind of Western generalized, universalized sense, but also as any kind of specific elements of landscapes, particular species, kind of mountains, rivers. And so this example here gives kind of just a whole set of examples of how those life frames might articulate particular broad and specific values and value indicators of rivers and fish that live within them. So what are the 4 life frames? Living from considers nature as a resource, thinking about its services, its uses, things like the learning we take from nature. Regulating services can be important because obviously they underpin our prosperity, and the way we can you can sustainably use those resources. But the values that are associated with them are mostly instrumental. So thinking about nature as a means to an end. But also some relational values, so meaningful relationships that we have with nature that are not as substitutable as instrumental values are. So obviously the relationships, for example, that fishermen have with the sea goes beyond that sense of just nature as a means to an end. It also there's important relationships there that we can't easily substitute for other instrumental relationships. And then there's living with nature, where nature matters for its cycles, its life support processes. Nature matters as wild spaces. Nature matters for the species that we coexist with. So really it's thinking about nature as an important other. And this is mostly associated with intrinsic values and also relational values related to understanding nature in that way. But there's also some instrumental values there. For example, thinking about existence value in a total economic value framework. Then there's living in nature, where nature is thought of as place. So the places we work, where we live, where we recreate, and that support meaning, cultural and individual identities, place attachment. So again, relational values are really important here, but also in some instrumental values, for example, around tourism and recreation. And then finally, living as nature, which is where we think of nature as ourselves, or ourselves as part of nature. So nature matters because it's what constitutes us. So this transcends the dualism of frameworks like ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people, or NCP. There's embodied perspectives. There's an emphasis on non-separateness from nature, an emphasis on understanding nature as oneness. And this is often expressed in practice of care, kinship, reciprocity with the more than human world. And it kind of brings relational intrinsic values together, thinking of nature, as important in its own right, but because it's not separate from us, that's also an intrinsic relationship between us. So a huge amount of detailed systematic review that we've gone through, and with IPBES. Key reasons why we've introduced this is that there is a real kind of limit of how many interdisciplinary frameworks there are for organizing values. And we wanted to move beyond, but also stay inclusive of ecosystem services and NCP, but have better recognition of intrinsic values, better recognition of place through living in nature, and holism through living as nature, and putting those on an equal footing with the more traditional living from and living with frames that have really dominated valuation so far. So we had a case study in IPBES around marine local communities, where we did secondary analysis of almost 150 community voice interviews from a whole range of projects around the UK. And what was really interesting was that the predominance of different frames that arose in these interviews, it rather varied between different projects. So for example, in Living Coast, where the focus was on community access to the sea, living in nature was really very prominent. But that had also to do with the policy context of that project, where the questions were around kind of access to the coast and equity in relationship to that. Whereas when we were talking about common ground, which is much more focused on fisheries and marine protected areas, there was a more balanced set of frames where living from nature, living in nature, and living with nature had kind of an equal footing in those interviews. So what we learned really is that the way that policy frames are brought into methods like, in this case, community voice methodology, but also more broadly, that will really determine the kind of output in terms of what frames are emphasized. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go through some really interesting quotes from the results here. But another thing that was really interesting in this study was that local people associated sustainability very strongly beyond ecosystem services. It wasn't particularly associated with ecosystem services or instrumental values or benefits from nature to people. It was mainly described in the context of living with and living as frames. And so a lot of reference on the importance of nature for its own sake, but also our direct connection to nature, and in particular, a sense of embodiment in relationship to the sea. So almost a third of participants expressed embodied values, where they were talking about their direct experience of the marine environment rather than just views or opinions of it that underpinned their values. So, it's a really tiny dip into a huge study, really, with thousands of sources screened, and hundreds, almost 150 interviews in this particular little case study. But overall, we could say that the IPBES life frames provide a simple and inclusive way of organizing sets of values. It's really about recognizing that the way we frame nature can get to the heart of why value conflicts occur. The way that we think about nature often underpins how we look at scientific evidence, how we look at kind of other stakeholders. And deliberating on life frames, making explicit what those frames are, is for us really important when we try and form shared values between us, between different stakeholders. However, the living from nature frame has been heavily dominant in policy and values. And that needs to change for sustainability transformation to occur in a just and inclusive way. And including multiple frames will strongly influence what values are recognized. So by including more and different frames can better recognize the nature's intrinsic values, more holistic and embodied values. And this can effectively support sustainability transformation because there's more values we can draw on for sustainability, but also it can address potential conflict. And then finally, just acknowledgements, all the many authors that contributed to chapter 2 of the IPBES Values Assessment. And then in particular, Jordan Blanchard Lafayette, supported by Sib O'Connor and Jill Ainsworth, who did data analysis in the UK case study, and Sue Ranger for ownership and contribution of the community voice data. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Jasper.